Hello, I'm Ron Franklin for Bassmaster's Classic Yearbook. Winning the Classic is by design one of the toughest achievements in professional bass fishing. When you're competing in a tournament with the best of the best, you often have to go against conventional wisdom by finding a strategy that others have simply overlooked. In 1996, one angler did just that and won it all.
I remember that Classic in 1996 on Lay Lake there south of Birmingham. It was a tough one.
The fish weren't biting anywhere. I mean, it was one of the toughest bites that anybody can ever recall on Lay Lake.
But I do know that some of the fishermen, a lot of the fishermen told me that they had the best pre-practice period they'd ever had at the lake.
That's probably what I remember most, because pre-fishing was really very good as far as quality fish. And so a lot of us had a lot of high expectations going into that Classic.
So much happens in 6 weeks between the pre-practice and the actual tournament itself.
Things deteriorated for some reason. We had an extremely hot couple weeks leading up to the event. Fishing was not near as good.
Typical tournament fishing, everything had changed. The deep pattern almost completely evaporated, and so the dust became just a crapshoot.
Missed again. Doing more gambling, because obviously you come back, you've got the one practice day, and boom, you run out and try to check a couple of patterns and a couple of spots, and all of a sudden the fish are gone. They're not biting.
Your weight, 4 pounds and 8 ounces.
This has been a tough tournament for me, Ray.
I remember I couldn't get a bite that deep, and I had some little spots where I could catch limits. Where I really thought it was going to be gangbusters for me, it didn't work out, and it was on account of the water not moving.
Well, I'm sure the power generation schedules got changed up right before the Classic. Something like that had to happen for those fish to go completely dormant.
Because when they're pulling that water, it pulls those fish out of the points and they feed, and the fishing's a lot better. And when they're not, boy, it can be real, it can be real tough. It scatters the fish out. The best damn fishing day you could ask for, and I can't catch them. I don't know why they're not biting.
It didn't affect the shallow water fish, but it affected all the other contenders trying to catch fish out on structure, out on the deep water. Because when fish are relating to structure, when they're pulling current, is when they pull up to the structure and they bite good. But when they don't pull current, the fish seem to roam, and you can't key in on where they're located.
Those bass get conditioned to feeding at certain times of day. Say they generate water in the afternoon every day. So the bass will have current every afternoon starting at 1 o'clock. Well, that's when the bite starts. Well, if they do that for 3 weeks in a row, and then all of a sudden they stop doing that, it really messes the fish up.
We don't have a switch we can flip it on and off when we want it, so you're just at the mercy of the power company.
Competitive fishing has many factors that are beyond the angler's control. The ability to adapt to these elements throughout the course of a season puts a pro in contention for Angler of the Year. In 1996, the Angler of the Year race came down to the final event, a shootout between Kevin Van Dam and Jim Bitter.
Going into the last tournament, it was still pretty much neck and neck. I had a pretty good lead, and all I had to do was finish in the top 20, and I don't think Jim could pass me.
And I felt confident going in that tournament, but I knew Kevin had a fall smack on his face for me to catch him.
Jim, that whole season, was on his game. He was on top of his game.
Coming over it. Get around her. Watch your hands. All right, all right. There's a hero. And after the first day, Jim was leading the tournament, and I was like way down in 75th place. It was just one of those things that first day, maybe the nerves got to me a little bit. I fished way too fast, ran around too much, and I kind of let the bad thoughts get the best of me.
Kevin zeroed or caught one fish the first day. I can't remember what it was. I mean, just absolutely terrible.
It got real interesting, and Jim's a good friend of mine, and obviously I don't think he ever want to wish bad luck upon anybody, but he was probably wishing a little bad luck on me there.
And that son of a gun come back, and ended up doing really well in the tournament, even with that one bad day. And I finished 8th in the tournament, and I could have won it and still not have won Angler of the Year.
You don't have to give Kevin a whole lot of room. Show him a crack in the door and he'll blow the doors off the hinges.
He had such a great comeback, and that's typically Kevin.
I was fortunate to be able to come back and put it together, and I ended up having a pretty solid finish in that last tournament of the year to lock it up.
He blistered me. That was one time I wish I'd have been head-to-head with somebody else, because I don't think they'd have made a comeback like Kevin did.
The first day of the event at the Bassmasters Classic, all of us anglers pretty much have the water to ourselves. You know, there's a few spectators out there, but they really don't know who to dial in on.
The first day, there was nobody around or anything like that, and I went down there and you know, it worked out well. I caught them real well.
There's a good one.
Well, you know, Kevin, I remember that particular classic. I remember him saying that he doesn't believe in a lot of luck either, but he said, you know, I kind of got a little lucky out there today. I think some fish were schooling around him and some things happened, and he took advantage of it.
Kevin unfortunately caught that big stringer spotted bass suspended on a crankbait down in the lower end of the lake in clean water. Well, when I went by Kevin the second day, he had some 50 boats that were out there with him. And you cannot catch those kind of fish when you have that many trolling motors and big engines being cranked around you.
I'd finally settled into an area that I really liked, and I had a limit in the boat, and I was just trying to call up, and I hear this, sounds like a bunch of pissed off bees. And around the corner, I see this boat running like a scalded dog, and it's Kevin Van Dam. And he's not a factor where I'm fishing at all. He just went by and I just happened to notice it was Kevin. Well, what followed was unbelievable. It seemed like there was 100 boats came around that corner of the river and blew out the area I was fishing. I mean, turned it to solid mud, and I was fishing clear water. I felt sorry not only for myself, but for Kevin to have to deal with that everywhere you go.
Idling around, trolling motors and all that noise, and when I showed up, they just all moved out of the way, and I started fishing, and I knew what the outcome was going to be. I had a good opportunity today. You know, I had a couple of big fish get off, and it's just, you know, when it's going your way, it's going your way, and when it's not, it's not.
As Kevin's experience illustrates, professional fishing has its frustrating moments. Having the right attitude is one element that can lead to longevity in the sport. Case in point, Arkansas's George Cochran.
George is an excellent fisherman. He's proven that. But what most people don't know about the fishermen is their personalities. And George is a gentleman George, he really is.
And probably the most laid-back individual ever to walk the face of the earth. I mean, everything's just okay with George.
And I remember asking him one time, do you ever get tired of doing this? And he said, tired? This is the most fun anybody can ever have.
There's just something about it I loved ever since I was a little kid. When I was a young kid, all the kids, we'd play baseball in the streets, or soccer, or football, but I didn't. Where was I? I was down there fishing, 7, 8 years old, walking the bank, fishing.
George will stay after it. George will stay after it. He's another one of those guys that goes practicing every day. And if he's not practicing fishing, or if he's not fishing, he's hunting somewhere. He's a true sportsman.
I know he loves to duck hunt. He'd trade off fishing, I think, sometimes to duck hunt.
George is the most laid-back angler I know. Easygoing, doesn't seem to get too excited about anything, but I don't know if you look back on some of the footage, the stare he had on his face, how he was focused, competing out there, that tells you all you need to know about the type of competitor that George is.
I was so focused on what I was going to do that I blocked everything out. And if you notice, like in the Masters in golf or the Super Bowl, if you ever look in their faces, if they ever show the pros right when the competition gets ready to start, they're so focused, they don't know what's going on around them. And that's the way I felt many a time. The last day I was so focused I block everything out. I've just got what I'm going to do on my mind.
Everybody has their own style, and George Cochran, he's very meticulous in his presentations. George is I call him a dirt dauber. I mean, he's going to be in shallow water any time of the year, and I mean, that's where he's the most comfortable, without a doubt.
He hates deep water now. He don't like reading that depth finder in bass fishing.
I don't know why he even has a depth finder on his boat. If it's deeper and he can't reach it with his rod tip, it's too deep.
He never compromises. I don't care if the fish are 50 foot deep, he's going to be fishing shallow. George is a throwback. He's a shallow water fisherman, and he simply works under one theory, and that is there's always resident shallow water fish someplace I can catch.
And he likes to get into places that nobody else would even dream of getting to. He'll chainsaw through fallen trees and dig his way into areas. And I mean, when his trolling motor's kicking up mud, he's happy.
He's got patience, the patience of Joe. And he'll sit there and he'll throw 5 different lures 50 times at the same target if he thinks there's a fish there.
He's going to fish the way he likes to fish and the way he has had success, no matter where you go. And one thing you're going to definitely know about George, if he's fishing in areas, because he's found some fish and that's the way he likes to fish. And he does his own thing, and it's worked for him, obviously, very well.
As a rule, people think of July fishing as being deep fishing. In that classic, of course, George Cochran went against conventional wisdom, but only as George Cochran could do.
Most people were fishing out on the river because that's where 90% of your fish were. They were out on the river channel because that's the time of year most of the fish move out on deep structure.
Everybody was thinking beforehand it was going to be a structure bite. Some of the guys had just killed the fish in the pre-practice time on a spoon, on deep diving crankbaits, slow rolling big spinner baits.
I just felt that, you know, after my practice period, that the deep water bite was my best chance.
I had found fish deep, and I intended on fishing them, but that deep water structure bite was not working during that classic.
And when that happens, it worked perfectly for him because everybody else, mine was deep, and George was the only one really thinking shallow, so he had it to himself.
I would have never dreamed in my wildest dreams that that pattern even existed. And George showed us all a lesson there.
Well, I got one.
Well, I was George Cochran's press observer going in the last day, and George had a little small bay, maybe 30 acres all to himself. And there's a good reason he had it all to himself. To get to this little bay, it was like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride.
Way back in a real shallow, flat creek that most people were afraid to even run into.
I had marked me a trail. In other words, I'd found a way that I could run the boat wide open without tearing it up across a foot of water.
I knew George had been back there for several days, and I still was hanging on for dear life because he ran across the water and skirted stumps and bounced from point A to point B. And when he got back in this little shallow bay, it was indeed shallow. I mean, the whole time he fished, his big motor was digging up mud, and it was just a muddy little bay, but he had it to himself.
They couldn't even get a camera boat in there to watch me. They had to drive around, and the camera guys had to walk through all these woods and brush and stuff.
Well, what he didn't tell us was the neighbors had a big dog. So we go in there and unload 3 of us with a camera and hauling a 12-volt battery and other things around, and all of a sudden we're woof, woof, woof.
Bye, Bob. Don't let that dog get you.
You know, typical George. He's going to make it tough on everybody, including the camera crew.
I remember one cameraman got fire ants all over him. I heard him screaming and running through the woods. And they did get some pictures of me catching fish back there, but I didn't have anybody bother me.
And to have a spot to yourself in the Bassmasters Classic is a major luxury.
Another little one.
George's philosophy that within each reservoir or with each body of water, there's a certain number of bass they call resident bass that just don't move around or move in other areas. And the thing he had going for him there was that those bass hadn't been pestered. Nobody had been in there fishing.
Just dissecting that thing like he was a surgeon. He picked apart the stumps. He picked apart the boat docks, the little grass lines. He caught a huge number of fish and just amazingly efficient in how he went about things. He caught fish in 6 inches of muddy water where you would think a fish would even live.
That's more like it.
Well, you contrast the 2 patterns between George Cochran and Davy Height. Primarily, Davy went with a regular summertime pattern, and George spent more of his time in the backwaters.
I really had a tough pre-practice and didn't feel real good going into that tournament. I can remember telling my wife, man, I hope I don't get embarrassed in this thing. But I had one really sweet spot. I can remember it was 11:30 that first day, and I told my partner, I said, I got one more place. If we don't catch something there, we're in trouble. And I pulled up and I caught a limit in like 5 or 6 casts. You know, I went from thinking, man, I'm worried about being embarrassed in this thing and fishing really hard, and all of a sudden being right in the thick of things, having an opportunity to win.
Davey in that tournament really kind of had all his eggs in one basket. He had one spot that he caught the bulk of his catch from, and it was kind of on a big flat in the creek, and it was real good to him. You know, I mean, he caught them there every day.
Probably the only deep fish that I know that were being caught consistently.
And it really looked like Davey would probably win the tournament.
There's a lot of cat and mouse in the Classic. You don't necessarily want to start on your best spot because then the fans will follow you, and then if you start there and you leave, then they might fish. But there's also a risk involved. If you don't go to your best spot, another competitor gets there before you do, then you've lost your best spot.
What's interesting about the Lay Lake Tournament Classic is that George Cochran, Davey Height, and Mickey Bruce, the top 3 anglers, all at one time or another were fishing the same water.
Well, you know, Mickey was, I think, leading going into the last day, and George was in second or third. I mean, we were all in a tight, and I was fishing an area real close to there was my main spot, and then my backup spot I could see there were 2 boats each day coming in and fishing the same little timber area that I was. I had no idea who they were.
It's like a big chess match. And George, of course, most of his fish are caught in that shallow backwater up the river. But he did have a couple of spots down there in that one creek.
Woo. And for some reason, I never noticed Davey Height or Mickey Bruce ever fishing in this area when I'd go down there. And the last day of the tournament, I went down there early, and there I look up, and not 200 yards from where I'm fishing, there's Davey Height. I look over to my right, and there's Mickey Bruce.
They all cranked in front of each other, all for a couple hours.
What those guys do, I have no control over whatsoever. I mean, you can't help but think about it. You're only human. But I try my best to focus on every minute, every second of that competition day and be as efficient as I possibly can. And when I come in, see how I did.
Mickey Bruce tied for first place. He got to have some fish.
Well, I fished with Mickey Bruce that last day, and Mickey was having a tough time.
And I just didn't get a big one to bite the last day. And I knew if I was able to get those 1 or 2 bites, I would be the Classic champion.
This is going to put you in the lead without question. 3 bass. And the weight, 3 pounds 9 ounces. Let's give him a good hand, folks. He's taking the lead. A couple of fishermen or so behind him.
No complaints whatsoever. I give it my best shot, and it just wasn't good enough.
General George Cochran from Hot Springs, Arkansas. Second place with 22 pounds and 8 ounces. He needs 4 pounds and 8 ounces to take the lead in the Bassmaster Classic.
I remember the final day just like it was yesterday. You don't forget those things.
These guys, when they get back to the dock before they put their boat on a trailer, they talk, these pros do it. And George knew it was going to be tight between him and Davey Height, but he was thinking maybe he had a pound or half a pound advantage.
I heard that Davey Height had a good string, and then you just hear talk. And I knew it was between me and Davey Height. It's going to be ounces. We didn't know.
A lot of the people really thought Davey had won. A lot of the sports writers, and that was kind of the buzz I remember in the parking lot is, hey boy, you know, he's probably got it.
The tension that grows in you thinking about, I have a chance of winning, just having a chance of winning, because you don't realize how important it is winning the Classic.
George, you have to have 4 pounds and 8 ounces to claim the lead. 5 bass, all alive. And the weight, 9 pounds, 5, 6, 9, 6. 9, 6, hold it, 9, 6. That gives him the Bassmaster Classic Championship. All he needed was 4-8. We've got one more man to come in.
while I was waiting to go in and weigh. You know, a lot of things went through my mind. I was sitting there thinking, you know, if you win this deal, it'll give you some longevity and a sport and some security for you and your family.
Davy Height from Prosperity, South Carolina. Third place. Got to have 11-13. Now there's a hold. Let's show the B team. B team, how many is that? 4 or 3? That's 4. That is a tie. We could have a tie. Dewey could be a tie. He's got to have 11-13, Dewey.
It could be a tie, Ray. It's going to be very close.
Davy Height, got to have 11-13. Now 11-13 will actually win for him. Be awful close. 10 pounds and 12 ounces. George Cochran is our winner.
That was like a swift kick in the stomach. It really was.
That was something that Davy, I think, just has carried with him since that time.
To lose, to finish second in the Classic hurts. I don't care who it is. But it doesn't hurt quite as bad when somebody wins that you've got a tremendous amount of respect for. And I've got a tremendous amount of respect for George Cochran.
But he was very disappointed when I won my second Classic and beat him out of winning his first Classic.
After the tournament was over, George came to me, and I'll never forget, he said,
David, don't worry, you'll win one.
And it won't be very long. And that meant a lot to me. It really did.
I tell you something on that Classic that I'll never forget. It really touched my heart. George had, he come up to me with tears in his eyes, and he said, man, I wish you could have won it. He said, I've already won one, you hadn't, and give me a hug. So that meant a lot to me, sure did.
Winner of the 1996 Bassmasters Classic, George Cochran.
You know, George, old gentleman George, he just went out there and found him a little mud hole and got away from all the boats and all the traffic and all the hoopla and just ground him out of victory. You know, it was just a tremendous win for George.
We were just incredulous that he could win the thing in a foot of water on a spinnerbait, you know, in August.
To me, that just showed that most tournaments that people do well in, you don't have to go with, you know, past successes and past knowledge to be successful.
George showed us all a lesson there. Fish your strengths. Fish the way you like to fish and tell all else.
That's the first rule of fishing, is there are no absolutes, you know, and George is walking proof of that.
On the trip from Lay Lake that final day, George Cochran's press observer joked about a livewell problem that George had experienced the previous day. Well, the talk was enough to get the already nervous angler to pull over. And when he checked his fish, he discovered that the livewell holding the 3 biggest fish was actually dry. Amazingly, he moved the fish over to the second live well, he added ice to the water, and all the bass were full of life when he got to the weigh-in. Good news for the fish, and great news for George Cochran, considering he won the Classic by 1 pound. For Bassmaster's Classic Yearbook, I'm Ron Franklin.